Generally, most DMing advice out there is pretty good, I'd say, but there are some that are really bad. So that's what I'm talking about today, the not so great advice. I'm gonna talk about why it's bad, make a little bit of fun of it just for our mutual entertainment, but I'm also going to share what I think the advice should be instead. That's right, instead of just being negative, we are actually going to try and learn something today. I bet you weren't expecting that. For the ease of viewing, I've made a YouTube-friendly numbered list with 3 pieces of bad DM advice. I know it isn't an increment of 5, but that's what I got. So, here we go. Number 1, don't over-prepare. First of all, I'm just really confused about what this advice is trying to say. Like, what? Don't over-prepare. Like, what does that even mean? It sounds like you're telling people to avoid preparing too much for a game, which sure, I guess is fine, but how do you know how much prep work is too much? Especially if you are a new DM and this is the first time you're preparing a session. How in the world are you going to know what over-preparing looks like? You don't even know what middle preparing looks like. In fact, I've ran quite a few games by now and I don't even know what over-preparing looks like, and I'm very curious about it. I assume the reason we shouldn't over-prepare is because something bad will happen if we do, right? That seems to be the reason why we share that kind of advice, like, don't touch the stove while it's hot, otherwise you'll burn your hand. So what is the bad thing here exactly? That we put too much work into the world, that it feels too real? I just imagine a DM sitting there doing an introduction of their own homebrew setting, and one of the players just interrupts it like, wait, dude, stop. You made your own setting for this? You did your own homebrew? Ew, dude, that's so nerdy. Like they just hate it for some reason. Even if this is an attempt to warn people of preparing things that you won't be able to fit in a single session, I just don't see how that's a bad thing. Like, what's the worst thing that can happen from that? That you'll be left with a bunch of stuff that the players can do in the next few sessions that you won't have to prepare for? What a catastrophe! Don't over-prepare is really just a messy pile of inconsistent advice of varying quality. It's like even the people who share the advice can't seem to agree on what it means. There's one camp of people who seem to frame this advice as a way of preventing people from burning out, saying stuff like, don't over-prepare your adventures in D&D. This is so important, especially if you don't want to burn out. It's a nice sentiment, don't get me wrong, but I'm not sure over-preparing is the right term for it. Maybe just stick to don't overwork yourself. But I've also come across posts where people talk about over-preparing as if it means planning out exactly how players will respond, saying stuff like, DMs, avoid over-preparing when possible. Role-playing games are largely about creating outcomes through play, not following a script. Or every plan you make that is based on the PCs taking a particular action will likely be wasted. Your players are creative and will go their own way. These people use the term over-preparing, however what they're talking about doesn't actually have anything to do with over-preparing, whatever that means, but rather a dislike of a specific area of preparation. Basically what they're saying is they don't recommend preparing for outcomes. They're not saying anything about over-preparing as a whole, they just don't want DMs to prepare in this specific area. In which case, why call it that? Calling that over-preparing is just a terrible description that does nothing but confuse people. I agree that it is generally a good idea to leave some room for players to handle a situation how they want to. That being said, once you get to know your players' characters, you can actually make some pretty accurate predictions of how they'll react in certain situations, which can give you, the Dungeon Master, the opportunity to set up some cool, narratively fulfilling experiences that your players will probably love if they're into that. So I wouldn't go as far as saying that any attempt to prepare for a player action is wasted. Basically, don't over-prepare is just a terrible and confusing way of saying that you should generally prepare encounters in a way where you have a bit of room to adapt to however the players decide to handle that situation. For example, if the players will need to convince an NPC to give them information, you should be aware that the way that the players decide to acquire that information might be different than you anticipated. That's it. Number 2, railroading is bad. This is a piece of advice I see thrown around a lot. Like a lot. In case you're wondering why we're talking about trains all of a sudden, let me explain. Railroading is a term used, at least in the tabletop role-playing space, as a way to describe a style of game mastering where the GM forces the players to follow a predetermined plot or path, limiting their choices and agency. Now, you might be wondering, why would people do that? Honestly, being a game master is tough. There are already a lot of things that you have to prepare for a game, and if you don't enjoy creating on the spot, being ready for 1 billion different paths that your players could take is exhausting. But you might now be thinking, okay, Luxie, that's fair, but if railroading feels bad for the players, why did you put a piece of advice that discourages it on your list of bad DM advice? Well, get ready everybody, toot, because here comes the hot take. Railroading isn't always bad. Now, before you banish me to the astral plane or something to reflect on my terrible opinions, hear me out. If the DM knows the player characters well and knows what kind of experience the players are actually looking for, then hopping on a railroad track that takes you through that experience is fun. Railroading is only bad when players are forced down a path or into an experience they don't want. If you like thrills, a roller coaster is a great time. If you don't like thrills, then getting forced on a roller coaster is scary and annoying. The trick to making railroads work is to place them down as you go with the character's goals in mind at all times. And place them down in a way where following those tracks is simply the most straightforward way towards their goal. I remember Brennan Lee Mulligan explaining something similar with an analogy that I'm probably going to get wrong, but he said something along the lines of, the players are like water. They have a goal of getting from the top to the bottom because of gravity or something. What your job as a dungeon master is to place down little slides and turns that make your players go woo and wee. The water runs down those slides not just because it's fun, but because it's simply the most straight and direct path towards their goal, reaching the bottom. And by the end, you've made a water ride that wasn't a straightforward path at all, but it was always progressing towards their goals, which made it exciting and fun. It's like those fun log flume rides at theme parks where even though you are not always going down a steep decline, you're always moving closer to that big drop that takes you back to the loading area. Hopefully I didn't lose all the profoundness of the analogy by talking about theme park rides. I'm pretty certain that wasn't in the original. Number 3, it's the player's story. This is a relatively well-meaning piece of advice that's usually sent out in a similar tone to this. Remember, it's the player's story. As long as they're having fun, you are doing a good job. It's a nice message, there's not really anything wrong about it, and I think the reassuring tone is really nice, especially if you're new. I just don't like the way it completely ignores the DM's experience. Like, what about them? Sure, it's mainly the player character's story and their fun is important too, but shouldn't the DM's fun be just as important as the rest? I'm sorry to say this, but if you're DMing a game where everyone is having fun except for you, something should change. Playing D&D together should be fun for everyone involved, including the DM. That's the whole reason we play the damn game. I just really don't want people to feel like their enjoyment is less important than the rest. You want to play in games that are an experience that both the players enjoy playing in and the DM enjoys facilitating, regardless of which role you're in. How do you get there? I'm not sure, but if you're not enjoying an activity that should be enjoyable, I think the first step is being honest about that and sharing that with your group. It's about that good old communication. The more I look at it, the more I realize that the common thread between most bad DM advice is being too general. And I don't know if you've noticed this too, but general advice is pretty bad. I guess I just wish people would add a little more nuance, but maybe that's too much to ask of the internet. Anyways, have a great day and may the dice roll in your favor.